Chapter 3 19 years earlier. Year 855 PXF. Late winter. As Anson instructed, Osman waited patiently on the couch for his father's long overdue arrival. For months he had been waiting patiently, but today, Anson assured him, was finally the day. His excitement had nearly resulted in him bouncing the couch off its legs, toppling it and himself a half-dozen times in his enthusiastic anticipation. Osman heard the approach of people coming down the hall. Anson calmed him with a gesture and a smile, mouthing the word "wait" through his warm grin. The door opened and Osman stood on the couch cushions, ready to greet his renowned father home from his Omanara. His exuberance drained when an old man leaning heavily on a tall, thickly muscled woman was half carried, half dragged over the threshold. Not understanding, Osman looked to Anson, whose face had drained of color as concern and worry replaced any sense of frivolity that was once there. Osman's caregiver rushed to the door to help carry the broken man into the residence. "Tavi, what has happened?" Anson asked. There was no response from the man as he lifted his eyes to the question. The tired, haunted orbs scanned the room and alighted on Osman, filling with resentment.
"Don't make me see him. I can't,"
dribbled out of the old man's slack lips. In that same instant, Osman registered what Anson had said. He had called this shell of a man Tavi. They were carrying his father. Anson and the woman moved his father quickly into his bedchambers and closed the door, leaving Osman shocked and uncomprehending on the couch. Could that man be his father? He had worked so hard and memorized all the stories of the heroic shaman whose voice commanded the elements. A holy healer of all wounds. The farseer who, without any aid of magic, imagined a better world when all that surrounded him was war. That person was none of those things. And the way he looked at Osman, that was not how fathers looked at sons. That was how one looked upon finding that worms had spoiled a barrel of apples. Present year, 874 PXF. Early summer. Osman awoke to the keel of a rancid worm crawling across his tongue. His body reflexively gagged and attempted to spit the invader out of his mouth, but the phantom emotion and sickly sensation it evoked quickly dissolved into memory. Moonlight streamed across his face through the gap in the curtains as Osman drifted out of the liminal space between dream and reality, his back nagging at him for the folly of sleeping in his childhood bed. The moon had stripped all color from his room just as thoroughly as his actions had stripped the emotion out of them 8 years before, but apparently the same could not be said for his dreams. He attempted to adjust his position and rediscover sleep, but his mind betrayed his effort, deciding instead to stay fully awake without even a hint of drowsiness. Osman sat up and couldn't help but look at the 21 marks in the log running over his bed. 18 more faces and names had stepped into his life after he had made the first 3 marks. All had been concerned for his well-being, but they had never been concerned enough to stay. At 15, he had emancipated himself from the constant carousel of caregivers, having grown tired of their platitudes. For his last 3 years at Horizon's End, Osman had lived alone in his father's rooms until, after another 5-year absence, Tavi had darkened its door once again. That was the last of his father's homecomings Osman endured. He didn't share his father's home with him for long, and when he left, he ensured by his final act on the shores of Invenora that any emotional longing would never draw him back. Leaving his room, Osman drifted barefoot through the gray landscape of chambers that, after Anson, never again felt like home. He tried to ignore the gravitational pull of his father's studio, but on his 4th orbit around the colorless rooms with no anchor holding him elsewhere, Osman discovered he was standing outside the studio's unlatched door. It was barely pushed into the frame, allowing a crack of blazing moonlight to cut the darkness like a razor blade. He leaned into the door, letting it swing open, and peered inside. Osmond had been in his father's studio dozens of times while living at Horizon's End. It was in no way forbidden from him. What had kept him away was its transformation from a place of color and light before his father's first homecoming to the dark, tormented place it was now. Tavi the Farseer, an artist of peace and a future without war, could never again capture beauty on canvas after that day. When he did lift pigment-laden brushes to paint, only despair and darkness flowed from them. The studio walls, which had once displayed the exuberant splattered colors of artistic joy, were now a showcase of gray and black, thrown at their surface in desperation and pain. The hope that gave Tavi the moniker Farseer in his youth eluded him throughout Osmond's memory of the rest of his life, and presumably to the end of his days. A lone easel holding a large black canvas stood in the center of the studio. Shadows thrown by the moonlight darkened its surface and confirmed Osmond's assumption. Even though Osmond could only vaguely see the details, it was evident that the image was of a shattered pane of clear glass, frozen in time. The shapes of the flying shards and their razor-sharp crystalline edges were rendered three-dimensional by reflected streaks of stark white highlighting them. Against the dark studio walls and beams of moonlight pouring through the wide bay window, the image seemed to bleed off the canvas into every corner of the room. Osmond approached the canvas not only to turn it into the moonlight and examine it further, but to break the disconcerting illusion that enveloped the room. As the moonlight hit the canvas, its glow transformed the painting. What had been a flat black field showcasing a shattered transparent window burst into vivid life. The clear glass exploded with color, the pane now revealing itself as a stained glass mosaic in the moonlight. A warped red crescent moon loomed at the center, where there had been only darkness previously. Osmond involuntarily took a step back out of surprise, and the unnerving feeling of familiarity radiating from the scarlet moon. Only then, from a distance, could he perceive what was right before him. The highlighted crescent masquerading as a moon was light reflecting off one of the razor-sharp, curved edges of the vermilion blade. Talon's glaive was unmistakable in its shape and contour, dominating the center of the painting. Once recognized, Osmond could see the remainder of the blade cloaked in shadow, stealthily disappearing behind the brilliant shower of shattering stained glass. Eyes now drawn to the broken window, Osmond saw it was not depicting a pantheon of deities, or a mosaic of scripture, as most stained glass windows he had encountered in Arnador did. It represented the seasons. The specific Oldani motifs used were unmistakable as he examined the cascading shards. They were identical to the patterns and designs Osmond had used for his outfit at the gala. Hypnotized by the imagery before him, his gaze scanned for more hidden details. And there, centered below the false moon, was another. He recognized the dark silhouette of a featureless person with curves he knew as well as his Kroldran's blade. The voluptuous figure of Serena. Osmond's knees buckled, and he fell hard on his backside, scrambling away from the painting until his back bumped against the short wall under the window. How had his father painted this? Farseer was a romantic name for a young artist who dreamed of a world without war, not for some gift or magic sight he inherently possessed. He could not possibly know all these details about that night at the gala, the naming of his Kroldran, or how the blade and Serena would shatter the joy he had found only months after that pinnacle moment. Osmond stood and cautiously approached the painting, as though it was some venomous creature ready to strike. He tentatively ran his fingers over the broken stained glass, feeling the ridges of paint that created the image. The whole story of the gala was there in the shattered panes. From him standing on the tailor's dais, to him unbraiding Talon's hair in the baths below the Sojourn's Rest. While the scenes were not exacting replications of the actual moments, they were unmistakable to Osmond's eyes in their content. As his brain tried to comprehend what his eyes were seeing, the brushstrokes of paint under his fingertips began to feel like the broken glass they represented. The keel of crystalline razor edges slicing into his fingers spread to his palms, and a familiar presence laid their hand on his shoulder. Osmond could not repress the shudder of fear that skittered down his spine, for who would not have a moment of trepidation when the last friend paid them an unexpected visit? The god of death was not here to take him on his last journey. At least, Osmond didn't feel that was their intent. This was not the first time he had felt the presence of the last friend. They had wistfully lingered nearby during Osmond's incarceration as he lay buried alive in his cell beneath the Hall of Judgment. A palpable mournfulness filled their vigil over Osmond through those many days and long nights. During their time together in that place of despair, Osmond could sense the last friend's grief was not due to Osmond's impending demise. It was due to the last friend being powerless to rescue him from his suffering, even though their duty had repeatedly called them to this place. Through those endless days and nights, Osmond's initial sharp fury at the god of death eventually faded to dull resentment. He realized whatever covenants that existed between gods and fate had bound the last friend's hand from taking him. In Osmond's darkest hours, the keel of death's proximity became a comfort, reminding him that he was not alone. The shattered glass in his father's painting was now even more profound. Osmond's insight expanded through the last friend's touch, and he understood that Architavia Thorandus must have known he was dying as he painted the scene before him. Death had lingered over Tavi's shoulder with every stroke. Was it the god of death who gave his father this insight into Osmond's life? Osmond could feel the last friend's presence retreating from the room as the sharp sting of glass biting into his flesh faded entirely from his palms and fingers. He turned around to face the window, bathing his countenance in moonlight, his spirit subconsciously craving light after being in the presence of death. Osmond's eyes remained unfocused, lost in the revelations that had flooded his mind, until movement outside the window caught his attention. Beyond the small seating area behind his father's residence was a familiar form from his youth among the flowers. Alaris the Bloom Sage. The Bloom Sage was one of the rare, timeless Uldani elders who carried with them a pearl of enlightened wisdom that negated all constructs, such as clocks, calendars, social niceties, age, and gender. Even the last friend seemed to defer to their sage understanding of the greater world, instead visiting them not as an undeniable caller, but as a familiar guest who patiently sits for shared tea, awaiting their host's cue for when it is time for both to leave the table. Osmond balked at the idea that his recent visitation by the last friend was just an errand Alaris had sent them on, but he also couldn't completely dismiss it. Regardless of the answer, Osmond felt it unwise to tarry and not greet the unexpected visitor. He left the studio, stepping out into the night through the narrow access door onto the patio, and crossed the stony ground to the figure crouched over a patch of blooming midnight jasmine. Whenever Alaris made one of their few fleeting appearances through Horizon's End, Osmond had gathered new tales of their travels from the artists in residence. From every shore to every peak of the Uldani Isles, wherever flowers bloomed, people had spotted Alaris and, if lucky, were gifted one of their tiny, palm-sized canvases. Many would lurk near their presence, hoping to receive one of their treasured paintings, but most knew such actions were the surest way never to be gifted one. Their title of Bloom Sage was in reference to Alaris's uncanny knack of appearing just as a region's treasured native wildflowers were at their peak bloom. Never gardens or cultivated varieties, only flowers that could roam the land as they did, free and untethered. Many romanticized that the bloom sage did not chase the blooms at all, but that it was the wildflowers who greeted Alaris wherever they wandered. Osmond approached the hunched form, their feet planted wide and squatting so deeply Alaris's knees were level with their ears. Gnarled, dexterous fingers danced a sharpened porcupine quill across the tiny canvas palmed in their other hand, capturing the luminescent jasmine before them. Osmond waited patiently just behind them, beyond their peripheral vision, to avoid any interruption of their work. After a few moments, the quill stopped and disappeared into the folds of a simple set of infinitely patched and pocketed cinched robes. Alaris slowly stood and turned to Osmond. Their time-worn face was as unique as the secrets it kept. A turnip-shaped nose framed by deep golden eyes that held the same promise and danger of well-guarded beehives laden with honey. Rosebud lips made crooked by a knowing smile. Skin the texture of a beloved satchel that dutifully carried a lifetime of treasures, great and small. Their visage was a melange of nature's shapes and textures, as welcoming as spring and stern as the depths of winter. Alaris's sturdy form crossed to Osmond and, without hesitation, laid their weathered hands on his face in the traditional greeting Uldani used between beloved friends and family. A shocked, sharp intake of breath crossed Osmond's lips uninvited. It had been nearly a decade since another Uldani had overcome the revulsion he induced in them and read his face. Tears welled in his eyes, and he melted into Alaris's gentle touch as they explored his emotions etched there. Osmond had never interacted with Alaris directly before this moment, but knew through their touch that they invited him to return the gesture. He gently placed his hands upon their face. Osmond could read the tiny micro-expressions that flowed across Alaris's features as their fingers explored his life as written upon his own. Loneliness, abandonment, resignation, resolve, new joys, family, heartbreak, betrayal, torture, obligation, and now a swirling maelstrom of questions. He felt through his fingers upon their face that Alaris lived it all with him. With a strength Osmond did not expect, the bloom sage pulled his head to their own. As their foreheads touched, Osmond, for perhaps the first time since his childhood, felt someone truly saw him. There was no need for explanation, apology, or excuse. Such things were meaningless in light of Alaris's understanding of his life. After a moment's pause and a slight loving squeeze, the bloom sage released his face. Osmond slowly opened his eyes to find Alaris peering into his own.
"Your father carried a burden as well. One that damaged him as profoundly as you have damaged yourself and your memories of this place."
Alaris said the words without accusation or judgment.
"I was here the morning he received his Omenara, the same day you received your name, Osmond."
Alaris gave a slight nod to Osmond to confirm what they had just conveyed, and paused to let it sink in.
"A fated son tied to a fated journey."
Alaris then continued their statements, becoming a story in their delivery.
"The dawnflower vines had painted the cliffs violet, orange, and gold as they caught and magnified the first lightening of the sky as it heralded the coming of the sun."
Alaris's eyes brightened, their voice adopting meter and melody as their body began to sway with the cadence of their tale. Osmond's numbness to emotion in this place slipped away as Alaris wove their hypnotic account. More than words or chanting song or dance, Alaris slipped into the Uldani language of emotion and keel as one might slip into a warm bath. It was a language Osmond had eschewed as a youth. Indeed, he had only attempted it once. Not with his own body, but with the outfit he wore just over a year ago in a land he was now exiled from, standing within the courtyard of the brother he had betrayed.
"Tavi's Omenara was not the product of meditation or late-night wanderlust placing one's feet on the road. The Fate Singer, enigmatic fourth sister of destiny, visited Tavi herself to bind his life to her design."
Alaris's arms twisted above their head into the air, creating intricate patterns as though conducting an orchestra and weaving a tapestry simultaneously.
I did not see the Fate Singer, the Maiden of Destinies reborn, but knew her voice and heard the echoes of her workings. On this morning she played no mere grouping of simple chords, but a symphony resonating through the fabric of reality itself.
The bloom sage twirled around then, bent at the waist, hands touching the stone beneath their feet as they continued their intricate motions. Their feet stomped the ground as they rose, making the very stone of Horizon's End resonate with their story, arms weaving and voice crescendoing.
A song like none other. Everything touched by even its echo was forever changed by hearing it.
Alaris threw their hands wide, their body and face frozen in awe and terror.
And your father, poor doomed and blessed Tavi, was the focus of all its terrible beauty and power.
Alaris dropped to the ground in a squatting stance not unlike the one Osmond had found them in this night, except looking over their shoulder like a timid, frightened songbird hiding in the brush from raptors in the skies above.
The world held its breath, enraptured and fearful. All were desperate to hear the melody she sang more clearly, but none willing to face its terrible power.
Barely above a whisper, the bloom sage intoned,
Held frozen, strangled by fate's will. Every grain of sand and every mountain alike prayed for the song to stop, but also for it never to end.
Silence filled the night around them, and Osmond, frozen by cascades of keel invoked by Alaris's telling, found he too was holding his breath. When his lungs began to burn and beg for air, Alaris spoke again.
After an eternity of mere seconds, dawn broke, and Destiny's song faded with it.
A tentative, relieved smile began to turn their lips as the bloom sage looked back to Osmond.
The morning music of nature began to overtake the crashing power of the Fate Singer's symphony.
Alaris stood, arms open at their sides, turning in wonderment, like seeing the dawn for the first time. Their arms dropped to their sides, abruptly ending their reenactment of the memory. Voice, posture, and expression becoming bland by comparison.
And that is when I saw Tavi stumble toward me.
The change to the simple statement left Osmond's soul hungry for the sharing Alaris had gifted him with. But as the void within him swallowed his emotions once more, even that slipped away. In his youth, Osmond had prided himself on reading facts and histories of his father in the Zalian style, unencumbered by Kiel and the oral traditions of Uldani teachings. Now, by his own doing, when it came to his father and this place, that would be all he would ever have. The calloused hand of the bloom sage alighted on his shoulder and pulled Osmond's attention back to their words.
Tavi's body shook, and all color had drained from his sun-kissed skin. In a glazed-eyed daze, he said, I must leave, and await a call for aid from an old friend in the north, a blacksmith I once knew.
Alaris looked deep into Osmond's eyes.
Your father, mind seemingly still overwhelmed by the song, stood silent, then finally continued. I will then find the burden that I must carry for him.
After a moment of silence, Alaris answered the question in Osmond's eyes.
No, I did not know then where the Olmanara took him, or who this blacksmith was. But perhaps you now do?
They let the question hang in the air for a moment.
It wasn't until much later that I understood the burden he had taken up.
The elder Uldani gathered their breath.
More than half a decade later, not long after his return to the Isles and word of his broken condition had reached my ears, your father and I crossed paths for the last time. He was a broken man, struggling to cross the frozen high plains of Kaiflanor, and he was not alone. A boy was with him.
Osmond reeled from the statement. A boy? Osmond tried to calculate the years in his head. He had just turned 7 when the crumpled form of his father returned home. That was 19 years ago. In the brief mentions of Riken, Talon had said he had been looking for him for nearly 2 decades. The boy must have been Riken. But how? Osmond certainly would have seen a human boy at Horizon's End when his father was recuperating before he disappeared again, crossing paths with Alaris. Did his father hide Riken from him? And why had the Singer of Fate tasked his father to take this human boy, his future Krodran's first love, to Kaiflanor? Had his father abandoned him for a new son fate had burdened him with? One he'd never even known he had? Osmond's confusion turned to an outrage devoid of keel, fueled by what he saw as justification for every ember of disdain he held for his father. Jealousy planted its insidious seed in Osmond's heart, for Riken especially, but also for Talon. The love and obligation he held for his Krodran began to sour and numb. The parent Osmond had so desperately needed in his life had chosen to carry this burden for Talon over being a father to him. Alaris's words continued without pause, paying no heed to Osmond's darkening countenance.
The boy was dead. Only his spirit remained, but the boy traveled with Tavi nonetheless, his corrupted soul bound to a shard of crystal your father had driven into his chest.
The revelations were coming too quickly, and Osmond's thoughts couldn't change tracks. Had his father chosen a dead son over a live one? Was Riken the cause of the soul wound that had so damaged his father? As a child, Osmond had never understood how a soul could be wounded. It wasn't until much later that he realized how grievously one could injure that incorporeal part of oneself. A moment of reflection stilled Osmond's anger. The injury that had so changed Tavi and stolen the father he dreamed of having, the man in all the stories from the books he memorized, had been self-inflicted upon his soul, much like his own had been. The moment of empathy for his father turned numb, pulled into the ragged void within him where all emotions toward his father flowed. Osmond's anger reasserted itself as he painted a path like a trail of falling dominoes from his father's self-mutilation to his own. All for a dead human boy. Like an unbreaking tide, the Bloom Sage's onslaught of revelations pummeled Osmond.
Your father was on a pilgrimage, I suspect, taking the soul to the Argestian Inception, the nexus of the elements of air and water. Tavi had prepared himself in such a way that I believe he was going to petition the guardian of the Inception to begin cleansing the boy's soul for reincarnation.
Betrayal manifested in Osmond's senses. Its keel swept over him, twisting the world sideways as a profound vertigo buckled his knees and yanked his legs out from under him. A reincarnation? Not only had Riken stolen his father and his childhood, but even in death, his father fought to give Riken a second chance, rather than attempting to provide Osmond with a first one. The world tilted precariously under Osmond. Spinning stars filled his vision, and nausea racked his body as he hit the hard ground. Osmond, head on the cold stone beneath him and eyes unfocused, felt Alaris press a small square canvas into the palm of his hand as they said their last words to him.
The guardian of the Argestian Inception will know what happened from there. But be warned, for the ancient primordial ones, knowledge always has a price.
Osmond croaked a single word towards Alaris's retreating form.
Why?
His voice was still raw from screaming on the beach the day before, and weak from months left unused in the cells below the halls of judgment. Prone on the bare rock outside his father's lodge, Osmond realized the last meaningful words he had spoken to anyone were to Talon on the day of the revolt. Dagger plunged into his chest and locked in place between his ribs. Osmond, lying on the stone floor of the keep, had asked himself the same question he now posed to the Bloom Sage. A question he had screamed at the sunrise through tears and sobs when he found his father, broken and wounded as he was, had left again in the dark of night without saying goodbye.
Why didn't he choose me?
Alaris paused, turning to Osmond's still prone form. Returning to him, they squatted down like a sage and wizened toad perched upon a lily pad and patted his cheek.
Only you can answer that, Broken One.